June 8, 1967, the Sinai Peninsula. The heat is not the only thing distorting the horizon. Across the shifting sands of the Mitla Pass, the air shimmers with the catastrophic aftermath of a slaughter. To the naked eye, it looks like a scrapyard of twisted metal stretching for miles. Black plumes of smoke rising like funeral pyres into the cloudless blue sky. But to the Soviet military attachés arriving on the scene in their light utility vehicles, this is not just a battlefield defeat. It is a technological impossibility. 250 Soviet-designed T-54 and T-55 tanks lie scattered across the valley floor like the discarded toys of an angry god. Turrets blown clean off their chassis. Holes perforated by impossibly small entry wounds. The metal around each penetration melted and flowed like candle wax. The numbers tell a story that Moscow does not want to hear. 250 Soviet tanks destroyed. Less than 40 Israeli tanks lost, most to mines and mechanical failure rather than direct combat. A kill ratio of more than 4-to-1 in favor of what Soviet intelligence had dismissively called obsolete American junk. The Israeli Defense Forces had done this with M48 Patton tanks, machines that every Soviet engineer knew were inferior on paper. Too tall, too heavy, too complex, armed with a mere 90-millimeter gun against the T-54's fearsome 100-millimeter cannon. And yet here in the scorching desert, the laws of physics and engineering seem to have been rewritten. How did a 75-cent piece of copper wire and an $847 mechanical calculator change the outcome of the Six-Day War? How did American engineering philosophy defeat Soviet metallurgical supremacy? And why did it take one man's courage to admit his own mistakes before his nation could learn from this catastrophe? Subscribe to Cold War Impact. We analyze the hidden history of the conflicts that shaped our world. Click the bell to stay briefed on the stories that matter. The man who would unravel this mystery was not at Mitla Pass that June morning. He was 2,500 miles away in Moscow, drinking bitter black tea in his office at the main armored directorate, about to receive a telegram that would destroy everything he had built over 20 years of his professional life. His name was Pavel Andreevich Sokolov. He was 42 years old, and he was about to learn that his greatest achievement was actually his greatest failure. But to understand why Pavel would risk his career, his reputation, and possibly his freedom to investigate what happened at Mitla Pass, we need to go back 24 years. Back to another battlefield. Back to the moment when a young Soviet tank crewman learned a lesson about engineering that would haunt him for decades. July 12, 1943. The Kursk salient, the largest tank battle in human history. 18-year-old Pavel Sokolov sat in the driver's position of a T-34 medium tank, part of the 5th Guards Tank Army's desperate counterattack against the German advance. The summer heat inside the steel hull was suffocating. The smell of diesel fuel, gun smoke, and human sweat formed a nauseating cocktail that made breathing an act of will. Through his narrow vision slit, Pavel could see the rolling wheat fields of the Ukrainian countryside, now churned into muddy chaos by hundreds of tracked vehicles. Artillery shells burst in the distance, creating pillars of black earth that hung in the still air like accusatory fingers pointing at the sky. The radio crackled with frantic Russian voices, commands, warnings. Death screams cut short by static. Pavel's commander, a veteran sergeant named Volkov, spotted the threat first. His voice cut through the internal chaos with the flat calm of a man who has already accepted his death. Tiger, right flank, 1,500 meters. Pavel felt his stomach clench. The German Tiger tank was a monster, a 56-ton killing machine with armor so thick that T-34 shells bounced off like thrown stones. Its 88-millimeter gun could crack open a T-34 from distances that made Soviet return fire useless. Through his slit, Pavel caught a glimpse of the Tiger's angular silhouette hull down behind a low ridge. Only the turret was visible. The long gun barrel tracked smoothly, efficiently, like the head of a predatory snake selecting its victim. The first shot killed Lieutenant Konstantin's T-34 300 meters to Pavel's left. The sound was not an explosion, but a sharp metallic crack like a giant hammer striking an anvil. Pavel saw the turret hatch fly open and a figure emerge, arm wreathed in flames, tumbling into the mud, where it lay still. The second shot killed Sergeant Petrov's tank directly ahead. This time Pavel saw the shell's trajectory, a blur of motion too fast for the human eye to truly follow. only to comprehend after the fact. The T-34 lurched to a halt, smoke pouring from every hatch and vision port. Pavel's hands trembled on the driving levers. His throat was so dry that swallowing hurt. Every instinct screamed at him to reverse, to flee, to do anything except continue driving toward that German gun. Sergeant Volkov's voice remained steady. "Driver hard right. Get us into that depression. Gunner load armor piercing. We are going to flank him." The maneuver saved their lives, but not in the way Volkov intended. As Pavel threw the T-34 into a hard turn, dropping into a slight fold in the ground, the Tiger's third shot passed through the space they had occupied 1 second earlier. The shell's supersonic crack was so loud that Pavel felt it as a physical pressure wave against his chest. They spent the next 3 minutes playing a deadly game of hide-and-seek among the terrain features, using smoke from burning vehicles as concealment, trying to get close enough for their inferior gun to have some chance of penetration. And then luck intervened. Not Soviet skill, not tactical brilliance, just random chance. Another T-34 from a different company managed to strike the Tiger from behind at close range. The German tank's weaker rear armor gave way. Flames erupted from the engine compartment. The hatch opened and German tankers began to evacuate, only to be cut down by machine gun fire from Soviet infantry who had been hiding in nearby trenches. Pavel's T-34 survived that day. Sergeant Volkov did not survive the next week. Of the 12 T-34s in Pavel's company that morning, only 3 remained operational by nightfall. In the debriefing tent that evening, covered in oil and grime and the psychic residue of terror, Pavel asked his new commander a question that would define the rest of his life. Why can the Tiger see us first? Why can they hit at ranges where we cannot even aim accurately? The commander, too exhausted for political correctness, gave him an honest answer. Better optics, better range finding, better gun stabilization. The Germans designed their tanks like precision instruments. We designed ours like tractors. Mass production over refinement. It works because we have more tractors than they have precision instruments. You survived today because 10 other men died. That is Soviet doctrine. Pavel never forgot that answer. More importantly, he never forgot the feeling of helplessness as those 2 T-34s died because the enemy saw first aimed, first shot first. Superior engineering had killed his comrades as surely as the shells themselves. That night, lying in a muddy trench under a sky illuminated by distant fires, 19-year-old Pavel Sokolov made a silent promise to himself. If he survived this war, if he lived to see peace, he would dedicate himself to ensuring that Soviet tanks never again sent men into battle with inferior tools. He would make certain that future Soviet tankers would have every advantage that engineering could provide. They would not rely on luck or numerical superiority. They would win through technological excellence. This promise was born from idealism, from youth, from the genuine patriotic desire to protect his countrymen. Pavel could not know then that this same promise, this same dedication, would lead him 20 years later to design flaws that would kill thousands of the very men he was trying to protect. The road to catastrophe, they say, is paved with good intentions. Pavel's road began in the wheat fields of Kursk and ended in the desert sands of Sinai, 1946. The war was over. Pavel Sokolov, now 21 years old, demobilized from the Red Army with the rank of junior sergeant and a chest full of medals he never wore. He enrolled at the Ural Polytechnic Institute in Sverdlovsk, studying mechanical engineering with a focus on armor design. The Soviet Union was rebuilding. Cities lay in ruins, 27 million dead. An entire generation of young men gone. But there was also a sense of possibility, of starting fresh, of building something better from the ashes of catastrophe. Pavel threw himself into his studies with the intensity of a man trying to outrun his memories. Thermodynamics, metallurgy, stress analysis, ballistics. He excelled in every subject, but his professors noticed something unusual about his approach. Where other students sought to maximize armor thickness or gun caliber, Pavel always asked questions about the human operator. How long does it take an exhausted man to load a 24-kilogram shell? How accurately can a gunner aim when his body is being rattled by poor suspension over rough terrain? How does cramped space affect crew performance during the hour 3 of continuous combat? His thesis advisor, Professor Leonid Golovanov, a pre-war tank designer who had helped develop the legendary T-34, recognized something special in Pavel's thinking. Good engineering serves the human, Pavel Andreevich, Golovanov told him during a late-night discussion in the professor's cluttered office. Bad engineering enslaves the human to the machine. Never forget which kind you want to create. Pavel listened respectfully, but in his youthful arrogance, he thought the old professor was being sentimental. The lesson from Kursk had been clear to him. Better engineering meant better machines. Make the machine superior, and victory follows. The human element, he believed, was simply about adapting men to optimize technology. This fundamental misunderstanding would take 2 decades in a desert full of burning tanks to correct. In 1947, Pavel graduated top of his class and was immediately recruited into the secret tank design bureau at the Ural Tank Factory, number 183, the same facility that had produced the T-34 during the war. The Soviet Union was racing to develop a new generation of tanks to counter American and British designs. The T-44, a late war design, was already being superseded. Something better was needed. The design philosophy was clear and logical. Learn from the German Tigers and Panthers, but adapt those lessons to Soviet manufacturing capabilities and doctrine. The result would be the T-54, a tank that would become the most widely produced tank in history. Pavel was assigned to the powertrain and transmission group, but his natural curiosity and talent for system-level thinking meant he contributed ideas across the entire design. He was there in the smoke-filled rooms when crucial decisions were made, decisions that seemed brilliantly rational at the time. Keep the profile low. The T-54 would be just 2.4 meters tall compared to the American Pershing's 3.1 meters. Harder to see, harder to hit. This seemed like pure wisdom, the lesson of survival encoded in steel dimensions. Slope the armor steeply. The frontal glacis plate would be set at 60 degrees from vertical. This would make the effective thickness nearly double the actual thickness, deflecting shells that might otherwise penetrate. Mathematical certainty. Physics as armor. Prioritize the gun. A 100-millimeter rifled cannon derived from naval artillery, capable of destroying any NATO tank at range. Firepower superiority built into the design specification. Keep it simple. Fewer complex systems meant easier field maintenance, faster production, lower cost per unit. Soviet numerical doctrine demanded quantities that made expensive complexity unthinkable. Every choice made sense. Every decision was justified by combat experience, by mathematical modeling, by engineering logic. And Pavel, young and brilliant and eager to prove himself, contributed enthusiastically to this philosophy. He helped optimize the transmission for that low profile. He calculated the weight distribution to accommodate that steeply sloped armor. He took pride in every compromise that made the tank smaller, simpler, more producible. In 1949, the first T-54s rolled off the production line. Pavel was 24 years old and stood among the engineers watching those dark green machines rumble past during the October Revolution Day parade in Moscow. His chest swelled with pride. This was his contribution to Soviet defense. This would protect future generations of tankers from the fate that nearly claimed him at Kursk. The T-54 was everything Soviet doctrine demanded: low, powerful, simple, cheap enough to produce by the thousands. It was by every measure that Soviet military science considered important the perfect tank. And it was, for 1949. For the world as Soviet planners understood it then. But the world was already changing in ways that would make those 1949 assumptions catastrophically wrong. The years passed. Pavel rose through the ranks of Soviet tank development. Marriage to Marina, a schoolteacher from Moscow in 1952, the birth of their son, Alexei, in 1948, a comfortable apartment in a new building reserved for defense industry workers, respect from colleagues, recognition from superiors. By 1960, Pavel had reached the rank of lieutenant colonel and held a senior position in the main armored directorate, the GAB-TU, responsible for analyzing combat performance and recommending improvements. The T-54 and its upgraded variant, the T-55, had become the backbone of the Soviet tank force and had been exported to dozens of allied nations: Egypt, Syria, Iraq, North Korea, Cuba. Anywhere the Soviet sphere of influence extended, T-54s followed. Pavel authored papers on tank tactics. He reviewed after-action reports from Korea, where North Korean T-34s had fought American Pershings and Pattons. He participated in evaluation trials at the Kubinka Proving Grounds, where captured NATO vehicles were tested against Soviet designs. And quietly in reports that were read but not acted upon, he began to notice patterns that troubled him. In 1953, he had written a memo suggesting that the T-54's gun depression, its ability to aim downward, was insufficient for combat in mountainous or urban terrain. The gun could depress only 4 degrees below horizontal, a limitation imposed by the low turret roof that everyone was so proud of. Pavel had calculated that this would make it nearly impossible to fight from hull-down positions on reverse slopes, a significant tactical disadvantage. The memo was filed and forgotten. Gun depression was not a Soviet priority. Soviet doctrine emphasized flat terrain warfare, the great tank sweeps across the North European plain in any war with NATO. Mountains and urban fighting were secondary concerns. In 1956, during the Hungarian uprising, Soviet T-54s had struggled in Budapest street fighting. The low gun depression meant they could not engage targets in upper floors or basement positions without exposing their vulnerable belly armor. Several tanks were lost to Molotov cocktails and point-blank infantry attacks because they could not aim at close elevated or depressed targets. Pavel wrote another report. It too was acknowledged and ignored. In 1958, he observed trials at Kubinka, where T-54 crews competed in gunnery exercises against each other. He timed how long it took from target appearance to first shot. He measured the hit probability at various ranges. The numbers bothered him, though he could not articulate exactly why. The crews were adequate, the guns were accurate, but something felt inefficient about the process, some friction in the system that he could sense but not define. He was, without fully realizing it, beginning to understand that the human interface mattered as much as the technical specifications. But he lacked the vocabulary to express this insight and the evidence to support it. His old professor's words echoed occasionally in his mind. Good engineering serves the human. But Pavel still believed the T-54 was good engineering. After all, it worked, didn't it? It had been in service for nearly a decade without major failures. The cognitive dissonance between his growing unease and his investment in the T-54's success created a psychological barrier. He had spent his career championing this design. He had helped create it. To question it fundamentally would be to question himself. So he filed his concerns in the back of his mind and focused on incremental improvements. Better ammunition, improved armor composition, night vision devices. These were acceptable modifications, the kind of evolutionary development that every weapons system undergoes. The fundamental design, though, the basic architecture, that was sacred. That was proven. That was Soviet engineering excellence. And then came 1967, and everything Pavel believed was about to be tested against reality in a way that would shatter his professional identity and force him to choose between his ego and his conscience. June 9, 1967. Moscow, GAB-2 headquarters, 8:15 in the morning. Pavel Sokolov sat at his desk reading the overnight cable traffic from the Middle East. The Six-Day War had begun 3 days earlier with Israeli preemptive strikes against Egyptian airfields. The news was catastrophic. The Egyptian Air Force had been destroyed on the ground. Israeli armored columns were racing across the Sinai Peninsula. Syrian positions on the Golan Heights were under assault. But these strategic disasters, bad as they were, fell under someone else's portfolio. Pavel's concern was narrower and more technical. He was responsible for analyzing the performance of Soviet armored vehicles in combat, and the preliminary reports filtering in from Soviet military advisors on the ground were confusing. The first cable had arrived the previous evening. Egyptian 4th Armored Division reporting heavy casualties. Details unclear. Communications disrupted. More to follow. The morning brought more cables, each one adding fragments to a picture that made no sense. 103rd Tank Brigade. 42 T-55 tanks destroyed. Exact circumstances unknown. Israeli armor suspected. 15th Armored Division. Engaged Israeli forces near Mitla Pass. Lost contact with multiple companies. Survivors reporting catastrophic losses. And then, at 8:47 a.m., the cable that made Pavel's hands shake as he read it. From Soviet Advisory Team Cairo to GAB-2 Moscow. Eyes only. Classification most secret. Initial battlefield assessment suggests systemic failure of T-54 and T-55 tanks in engagement with Israeli M48 Patton forces. Casualty ratios far exceed predictable parameters. Impossible penetrations observed on frontal armor. Request immediate technical investigation team. Assessment critical. Pavel read it 3 times. Each time his confusion deepened. Systemic failure, not crew error, not tactical mistakes. Systemic failure of the tanks themselves. Impossible penetrations. The T-54's frontal armor was 100 millimeters of steel at 60 degrees. The effective thickness was nearly 200 millimeters. The American M48's 90 millimeter gun should not be able to penetrate that armor, especially not reliably enough to cause catastrophic casualties. Far exceed predictable parameters. This was bureaucratic language for something that should not be happening. Pavel pulled out his reference files on the M48 Patton. He had studied this tank extensively. Soviet intelligence had provided detailed reports. The M48 was by Soviet analysis an inferior design. Too tall at over 3 meters, making it an easy target. Gasoline-powered rather than diesel, creating a fire hazard. That 90 millimeter gun was considered obsolete compared to the T-54's 100 millimeter cannon. The armor was cast steel decent quality, but not as effective as Soviet rolled and welded plate. On paper, in every category, that Soviet doctrine valued the T-54 was superior. And yet somehow in actual combat, T-54s were dying in numbers that suggested the paper analysis was fundamentally wrong about something important. Pavel felt a sensation he had not experienced since that day at Kursk in 1943. The cold realization that the machine you are trusting with your life has a flaw you did not anticipate. That the equations you solve so carefully in the quiet of the design bureau do not account for some variable that only reveals itself when real shells start flying. His office door opened without a knock. General Semyon Bogdanov, commander of GOB 2, entered with an expression that Pavel had never seen on the general's normally composed face. Bogdanov looked like a man who had just discovered his house was built on sand. Sokolov, conference room, now. Bring everything we have on the M48 in the Mitla Pass engagement. The conference room was already crowded when Pavel arrived. 12 senior officers, representatives from the Defense Ministry, intelligence officers from the GRU, and several civilian engineers from the design bureaus. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and tension. General Bogdanov stood at the head of the table, illuminated by the harsh light of overhead fixtures that cast deep shadows across his weathered face. Behind him, a large map of the Sinai Peninsula was marked with red symbols indicating known Egyptian positions and blue symbols for Israeli forces. The map was dominated by red, but the red was crossed through with black marks. Destroyed units, overrun positions. Bogdanov's voice was flat, drained of emotion, which made his words even more disturbing. Gentlemen, what I am about to tell you is classified at the highest level. Nothing discussed in this room leaves this room without my personal authorization. Is that understood? Affirmative murmurs around the table. Pavel felt his pulse accelerate. As of 0600 hours this morning, our advisory team in Egypt reports the following casualty figures for Soviet-supplied armor in the Sinai theater. 900 T-54s and T-55 tanks deployed. Approximately 700 destroyed, damaged, or captured. That is a 78% loss rate in 4 days of combat. Silence. The kind of silence that follows the announcement of a death in the family. Israeli losses are estimated at less than 60 tanks. The kill ratio is approximately 4-1 in favor of Israeli forces. This ratio holds across multiple engagements in different terrain types, suggesting it is not a tactical or geographic fluke, but something systemic. Someone a Colonel Pavel did not recognize spoke up. With respect, General, could this not be attributed to the quality of the Egyptian crew's training deficiencies? Poor maintenance. Bogdanov's response was cutting. Our advisors trained those crews personally. The Egyptians have been operating T-54s for 10 years. Maintenance logs show the vehicles were in acceptable condition. No, Colonel, this is not about the Arabs being incompetent, though I am sure that convenient excuse will be popular in some circles. Something else is happening. He turned to face the map, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a note of something that might have been fear. One of our advisors, a Major Viktor Petrov, was at Mitla Pass yesterday conducting damage assessment. He sent photographs. Prepare yourselves. The lights dimmed. A projector clicked on, throwing a grainy black and white image onto the screen beside the map. A T-54 tank, its turret blown clean off the hull, lying 15 meters away like a discarded hat. The hull itself showed a single penetration on the frontal glacis, the heavily sloped armor that was supposed to be impervious to anything short of a direct hit from artillery. Click. Another image. A T-55 with a neat circular hole in its side armor. The metal around the hole looked melted, flowed as if it had been liquid rather than solid steel. Click. A third image, this one more disturbing because of what it showed. 3 T-54s positioned hull down behind a ridgeline, exactly as Soviet doctrine prescribed for defensive fighting. All three destroyed. The photograph was taken from the ridge they had been defending, looking back toward Israeli positions. Pavel immediately noticed the geometry. The Israeli guns would have been firing upward from lower ground at targets that were partially concealed. This should have been an ideal defensive position for the T-54s. Low-profile hull down, shooting down at exposed attackers. And yet all three were killed. The lights came back on. Bogdanov's eyes swept the room, landing on Pavel. Colonel Sokolov, you are our expert on comparative armor analysis. Explain to me how a 90mm American gun penetrates 200mm equivalent of sloped Soviet armor. Explain it in a way that does not require me to believe in magic. Pavel's mind raced through the possibilities. His mouth was dry. Every engineer in the room was looking at him, waiting for the answer that would make this nightmare make sense. General, there are several theoretical possibilities. The Americans could have developed new ammunition we are unaware of, improved penetrators, sub-caliber rounds with better ballistics. However, our intelligence on American ammunition development has been generally reliable. What else? Alternatively, there could be quality control issues with our armor plate, improper heat treatment reducing hardness, inclusions in the steel creating weak points. But this would have to affect hundreds of tanks to explain these numbers. Our metallurgy is sound. Pavel hesitated, then continued. There is a third possibility. The penetrations may not be kinetic at all. They could be chemical energy rounds, shaped charges, heat rounds. One of the intelligence officers, AGRU, Colonel, shook his head. Our assessment is that American heat technology is unreliable. The fuses are too sensitive. They detonate prematurely on sloped armor, making them ineffective. The Americans rely primarily on kinetic penetrators. Pavel felt the cognitive dissonance building. Everything he knew said this should not be possible. Every assumption, every calculation, every design decision made perfect sense according to the principles of tank warfare as Soviet doctrine understood them. And yet the evidence was undeniable. T-54s were dying. General Bogdanov made a decision. Sokolov, you will lead an investigation team to Egypt. You will personally examine the destroyed vehicles. You will determine what is killing our tanks. You will have complete authority to requisition whatever resources you need. You will report directly to me. And Sokolov, yes, General, figure this out. Because if the T-54 is fundamentally flawed, if our armor doctrine is wrong, then our entire defensive strategy is built on sand. The motherland has 65,000 of these tanks. If they are obsolete, we are defenseless. The weight of that statement settled on Pavel's shoulders like a physical burden. His life's work, 20 years of dedication, the tank he had helped design, the machine he had believed would protect Soviet soldiers, potentially catastrophically lethally flawed. And there was something else, something personal that Pavel had not shared with anyone in that room. His son, Alexei, 19 years old, was currently a cadet at the Kazan Higher Tank Command School. In 6 months, Alexei would graduate and be assigned to a tank unit as a junior officer. He would command a T-55 or its successor. He would trust his life to the engineering that Pavel had helped create. If there was a flaw, if the T-54 design was wrong in some fundamental way, then Pavel's own son would eventually sit in a steel coffin of his father's making. That night, Pavel sat alone in his apartment long after Marina and Alexei had gone to bed. He pulled out his old war notebook from 1943, a battered journal he had kept during the battles around Kursk. He had not opened it in years. On one page, written in the pencil scrawl of his 18-year-old self, he found an entry dated July 13th, 1943, the day after the Tiger engagement. I watched 2 T-34s die today because the enemy saw first and shot first. If I survive this war, I will make sure Soviet tanks are never inferior again. I will make them the best in the world. I promise. Pavel stared at those words for a long time. The promise of a traumatized teenager written in the euphoria of having survived when others had not. A promise that had shaped his entire career. Now, 24 years later, he had to face the possibility that he had failed to keep that promise. Worse, he might have created the very inferiority he had sworn to eliminate. He thought about Professor Golovanov's words from all those years ago. Good engineering serves the human. Had he served the human? Or had he served his own pride, his own assumptions, his own unquestioned belief in Soviet technical superiority? Pavel made a decision that night. Whatever he found in Egypt, whatever the truth turned out to be, he would face it honestly. If the T-54 was flawed, he would acknowledge it. If his design philosophy was wrong, he would admit it. Even if it destroyed his career. Even if it made him a scapegoat for a disaster. Because the alternative was to let more men die in machines that failed them. The alternative was to let his son someday face the same fate that nearly claimed Pavel at Kursk. He could not live with that. On June 15, 1967, Colonel Pavel Andreevich Sokolov boarded a military transport flight to Cairo. He carried with him precise measuring instruments, cameras, metallurgical testing equipment, and the weight of a promise made in the mud of Kursk. He did not know it yet, but he was about to discover that the secret to American success was not hidden in exotic metals or revolutionary guns. It was hidden in something far more mundane and far more devastating to Soviet pride. It was hidden in an $847 box of gears and cams in a philosophical approach to engineering that Soviet doctrine had dismissed as unnecessary luxury in the simple recognition that war is ultimately fought by humans, not by machines. The investigation would change more than Pavel's career. It would change Soviet tank doctrine, reshape the arms race, and save thousands of lives over the next 3 decades. But first, it would require Pavel to do the hardest thing any engineer can do, admit that he was wrong. The heat struck Pavel Sokolov like a physical blow as he descended the stairs from the Antonov and 12 transport at Cairo International Airport. After the cool Moscow spring, the Egyptian summer felt like standing in front of an open furnace. 43 degrees Celsius, the kind of heat that made thinking difficult and breathing an exercise in deliberate effort. June 17, 1967. 12 days into the war that was already over. Israel had achieved complete victory in 6 days exactly as the war would later be named. But the shooting had stopped only because there was nothing left to shoot at. Egyptian forces had collapsed. Syrian positions on the Golan Heights had been overrun. The Sinai Peninsula, that vast buffer of desert between Egypt and Israel, was now under Israeli control. And scattered across that desert were the remains of the largest armored force Egypt had ever fielded. Soviet tanks, Soviet doctrine, Soviet training, all reduced to scrap metal and burnt paint under the merciless sun. Colonel Yuri Novikov met Pavel at the airfield. Novikov was 45 years old, thick-shouldered, with the permanent squint of a man who had spent too many years in bright places. He commanded the Soviet military advisory mission in Egypt, a position that had been prestigious 2 weeks ago and was now probably career-ending. Novikov's handshake was firm, but his eyes were those of a man who had not slept in days. "Welcome to Egypt, Colonel Sokolov. I hope you brought answers, because I am fresh out of them." They drove in a Giaz Jeep toward the Soviet advisory compound, passing through Cairo streets that were unnaturally quiet. No celebrations, no crowds. The city had the stunned atmosphere of a place that had just watched its army evaporate in less than a week. Egyptian soldiers still in uniform walked with the hollow-eyed gaze of men trying to process catastrophe. "How bad is it really?" Pavel asked. Novikov lit a cigarette, his hands steady despite the stress lines etched into his face. "Worse than the cables said. We have been documenting destroyed vehicles for a week. Every time we think we have seen the worst, we find another valley full of burnt-out T-54s. Mitla Pass alone has over 250 vehicles. Some of them were killed from ranges that should not have been possible. And the crews? Many dead, some captured. The survivors we have talked to all say the same thing. They never saw what hit them. Or they saw it, but could not engage effectively. The Israelis were using terrain in ways our doctrine did not prepare for. Hold down positions on ridges, shooting down from high ground. Our tanks could not depress their guns enough to return fire without exposing their entire hulls. Pavel felt something cold settle in his stomach. Gun depression, the issue he had raised in 1953 and been told was not a priority. 14 years later, Egyptian tankers had died because of that dismissed concern. I need to see the battlefield. Mitla Pass, tomorrow if possible. Novikov nodded. Already arranged. But Colonel, there is something else you should know. We have been ordered to maintain the position that Egyptian crew quality was the primary factor. The political officers are already writing reports that blame Arab incompetence rather than equipment failure. And what do you believe? Novikov took a long drag on his cigarette, exhaling smoke that was immediately torn away by the hot wind rushing past the open jeep. I believe I watched Egyptian crews that I personally trained die in numbers that crew quality alone that cannot explain. I believe something is fundamentally wrong with our tanks, or our doctrine, or both. But I am not an engineer. That is why you are here, to tell us which prayer we got wrong. They spent that evening reviewing documentation. Novikov had been thorough. Maps showing engagement locations, photographs of destroyed vehicles, interviews with surviving crew members translated from Arabic. After-action reports from the few Egyptian units that had maintained radio contact during the collapse. One report caught Pavel's attention. An engagement near Birgavgafa on June 6th. A company of T-55 tanks 12 vehicles dug into prepared positions on favorable terrain. They had the first shot against advancing Israeli M48 Pattons. They had the range advantage. They had defensive positions. Within 11 minutes, all 12 T-55s were destroyed or disabled. The Israeli force lost one M48 to a mine. Pavel read the report 3 times. The geometry made no sense. Everything Soviet doctrine promises should have favored the defenders. Yet the results suggested the doctrine was not just wrong, but catastrophically, lethally wrong. That night, lying on a narrow bed in the Soviet compound, staring at a ceiling fan that did little except rearrange the hot air, Pavel thought about Alexei. His son was in his final year at Kazan, learning to command the same tanks that had failed so completely here. In 6 months, Alexei would graduate. He would be assigned to a tank unit. He would trust his life to the T-55, or whatever vehicle the Soviet army gave him. Pavel made a decision. Whatever he found in the desert tomorrow, whatever the political cost, he would tell the truth. Not the convenient truth, not the face-saving truth, the actual truth. Because lies, however comforting, do not stop tank shells. And his son's life might someday depend on whether Pavel had the courage now to admit mistakes. June 18, 1967, dawn in the Sinai. The convoy of 3 UAZ jeeps left Cairo at 0500 hours, while the sky was still dark enough that stars were visible. Pavel rode in the lead vehicle with Novikov and a photographer named Sergeant Markov. The other 2 jeeps carried metallurgists, a ballistics expert, and security personnel in case they encountered remnants of Egyptian or Israeli forces. They drove east on the road to Suez, then turned north toward the Mitla Pass. As the sun rose, Pavel got his first real view of the Sinai. Endless rolling desert, rocky hills, wadis cutting through the landscape like scars, occasional patches of scrub vegetation clinging to life in the hostile environment, and everywhere the detritus of war, abandoned equipment, burnt-out trucks, personal items scattered along the roadside dropped by soldiers in panicked retreat, boots, canteens, helmets, the archaeology of defeat. They reached the approaches to Mitla Pass at 7:30. Novikov slowed the lead jeep pointed ahead. From here it is better to go slowly. Watch for unexploded ordnance. The Egyptians mined these approaches. Some of those mines are still live. The landscape opened into a wide valley, perhaps 3 kilometers across, flanked by rocky ridges on both sides. And filling that valley in numbers that made Pavel's breath catch were the remains of Egypt's armored might. Tanks. Dozens of them. Scores of them. T-54s and T-55s scattered across the valley floor in various states of destruction. Some were merely disabled tracks blown off by mines or mechanical failure. Others were burnt-out hulks, the interior fires having consumed everything flammable. A few had their turrets blown completely off, sitting 10 or 15 meters from the hull, like grotesque sculptures. The smell hit Pavel as he stepped out of the jeep. Burnt metal. diesel fuel, oil, and underneath it all, something organic and sweet that he tried not to identify. Death had a smell. He remembered it from Kursk. It was the same here, just amplified by the heat and the scale. They walked among the dead machines. Pavel carried a clipboard, a measuring tape, and a camera. He had come here as an investigator, but he felt more like a medical examiner performing an autopsy on his own creation. Each destroyed T-54 represented hours of his design work made manifest in steel, now reduced to this. The first vehicle Pavel examined closely was a T-55 hull number 412 stenciled on the turret. It sat slightly canted, the right track blown off. But what drew Pavel's attention was the entry wound on the upper glacis plate, the most heavily armored part of the tank, the section that was supposed to be impervious. Pavel knelt next to the hole. It was circular, approximately 8 centimeters in diameter, far too small to be from a 90-millimeter shell. The edges of the hole showed something strange. The metal around the penetration had not been punched through cleanly. It looked melted, flowed, as if the steel had briefly become liquid before re-solidifying. He pulled out a magnifying lens, examined the edges more closely. The grain structure of the metal was disturbed, distorted by extreme heat. This was not mechanical penetration. This was something else entirely. Pavel climbed onto the hull, pulled open the driver's hatch, peered inside. The interior of the T-55 was a scene of devastation. The transmission block, a massive chunk of cast iron at the front of the fighting compartment, was shattered. Fragments of metal had ricocheted throughout the interior space, perforating fuel tanks, destroying equipment, killing the crew. The ammunition rack showed signs of secondary explosions, cook-offs, where the heat from the initial penetration had ignited stored propellant. But there were no large fragments of the penetrating round. No obvious residue from a high-explosive shell. Whatever had killed this tank had done so with focused, precise thermal energy rather than brute kinetic force. Pavel photographed everything. Measurements of the entry hole, close-ups of the melted edges, interior damage patterns. He worked methodically, keeping his emotions locked away behind professional detachment. Grief and guilt were luxuries he could not afford right now. Right now, he needed to be a scientist. By midday, he had examined 18 destroyed T-54s and T-55s. The pattern was consistent and deeply disturbing. 80% of the hits were on frontal armor, the sloped glacis plate that was supposed to deflect incoming rounds. Penetrations that should have been impossible based on the kinetic energy of a 90-millimeter shell. And every entry wound showed the same thermal characteristics: metal flow, heat distortion, minimal fragmentation inside the hull, but catastrophic damage to internal components. Sergeant Markov, the photographer, was documenting everything. He had stopped making comments after the fifth tank. The sheer scale of destruction had silenced him. Novikov stood nearby, smoking continuously, watching Pavel work with the expression of a man watching his career die in real time. The ballistics expert, a civilian engineer named Berezhkov, who had been flown in from Moscow, finally spoke up. He was 52 years old, gray-haired, with the permanent stoop of a man who had spent decades hunched over drafting tables. Colonel Sokolov, this is not kinetic penetration. I am certain of it now. The thermal characteristics are wrong. The metal flow patterns are wrong. This is chemical energy, shaped charge, heat rounds. Pavel nodded slowly. He had reached the same conclusion an hour ago, but had been reluctant to voice it. Because if Berezhkov was right, it meant something profoundly disturbing about Soviet intelligence and doctrine. Our assessments said American heat technology was unreliable, that the fuses would detonate prematurely on sloped armor, making them ineffective against our tanks. Berezhkov made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. Our assessments were wrong, Colonel. Catastrophically wrong. Look at this damage. These rounds functioned perfectly. They waited until contact with the armor, then detonated with enough focused energy to burn through 200 millimeters equivalent of steel. The slope did not matter. The angle did not matter. The physics we thought would protect us was bypassed entirely. Pavel felt the foundations of his professional knowledge shifting beneath him like sand. 20 years of metallurgical science. Decades of armor doctrine built on the principle that sloped armor was superior because it increased effective thickness. All of it negated by a different approach to the problem. The Americans had not tried to punch through Soviet armor. They had melted through it. They broke for lunch at noon, sitting in the shade of an overturned T-54, whole eating field rations that tasted like cardboard, and drinking water that was hot, despite being from insulated canteens. The heat was overwhelming. Pavel's uniform was soaked with sweat, his head pounded with the beginning of heat exhaustion. Novikov shared his canteen. "What are you thinking, Colonel?" Pavel was silent for a long moment, organizing thoughts that threatened to spiral into despair. "I am thinking that we designed these tanks based on assumptions that were reasonable in 1946. We assumed kinetic energy penetrators would be the primary threat. We optimized for that threat. Sloped armor, compact design. We made compromises in other areas, crew space, gun depression, ergonomics, because we believed armor geometry was paramount. And now I am thinking that while we were perfecting our armor against yesterday's threat, the Americans were developing tomorrow's threat. They did not try to match our armor thickness. They went around it. Chemical energy, Monroe effect, shaped charges, technology that makes armor angle irrelevant." Berezhkov interrupted. "There is more, Colonel. Look at the tactical situation. Many of these tanks were in hull-down positions when they were killed. You can tell by the orientation, by where the penetrations are, by the lack of damage to the lower hull. They were behind cover. Only the turret and upper glacis were exposed. That is correct positioning according to doctrine. Yes, but look at the geometry. These tanks were killed by fire from lower elevation. The enemy was shooting upward. Our tanks could not depress their guns enough to return fire without driving over the crest and exposing their entire hull. They were trapped, protected by cover that prevented them from fighting back." The full horror of it settled on Pavel. The T-54's low silhouette, the feature everyone was so proud of, had created a fatal limitation. The gun could not depress below 4 degrees. In any situation where the tank needed to fire downward from high ground or engage targets at close range with vertical separation, it was blind, helpless. Soviet doctrine had prepared for tank combat on the North European plain. Flat terrain, long sight lines, but the real world had mountains, ridges, valleys, urban environments. And in all of those environments, the T-54's limited gun depressions was a death sentence. Pavel stood up, walked to the edge of the valley, looked up at the ridge line to the west. He could see tire tracks in the sand. Israeli forces had positioned on those ridges, looking down into the valley. They had height advantage, clear sight lines, and the ability to engage from hull-down positions that Soviet tanks could not match. It was not even a fair fight. It was target practice. That afternoon, they interviewed survivors. The Egyptian command had provided 3 tankers who had been at Mitla Pass and lived to tell about it. They met at a field hospital where the wounded were being treated. The men were young in their 20s, with the hollow eyes of people who had seen something that broke their understanding of how the world worked. The translator was a Soviet advisor who spoke fluent Arabic. Pavel asked questions. The Egyptians answered haltingly, reliving trauma they were trying to forget. Lieutenant Mahmoud Hassan had been a T-55 commander, 26 years old, married, father of 2 children. He sat on a hospital cot with bandages covering burns on his arms and face. Through the translator, he told his story. "We were in position at dawn, good position, behind sand dunes. We could see the approaches. Our company commander said we would hold here, that the Israelis would have to come through this valley to reach the pass. We would destroy them as they advanced. What happened when the Israelis arrived? We never saw them arrive. We heard engines, then suddenly there were explosions. Tanks to my right and left were being hit. I looked for targets, but could not see the enemy vehicles. They were somewhere on the hills behind the ridges. Only their turrets were showing. Did you engage them? We tried. Our gunner tried to aim at them, but the gun would not go low enough. We had to drive forward over the dune to get an angle. As soon as we crested the dune, we were hit. I saw a flash. Something punched through the front of the tank. Then there was fire everywhere. I do not remember getting out." The other 2 survivors told essentially the same story. Ambushed by an enemy they could not see. Unable to return fire without exposing themselves. Killed within seconds of trying to engage. One detail recurred in all 3 accounts. The time between target identification and being hit was never more than 15 seconds, often less than 10. The Israeli crews were achieving impossibly fast engagement times. Spot aim, fire hit, all in the span of a few heartbeats. That evening back at the Soviet compound, Pavel sat alone in a briefing room with his notes spread across a table. The data was damning. 3 primary failures. First, the armor philosophy was obsolete. Chemical energy rounds bypassed the sloped armor advantage entirely. 20 years of metallurgical optimization rendered meaningless by a different approach to the physics of penetration. Second, the gun depression limitation was crippling in any terrain that was not perfectly flat. The low profile that made the tank harder to hit also made it unable to fight from superior positions, a fatal compromise. Third, and this one troubled Pavel most deeply, because the data was less concrete but the pattern was undeniable. The Israeli crews were simply faster. From target acquisition to first shot, they were achieving times that should not be possible with optical range finding and manual gun laying. Something about the American fire control system was giving them a critical advantage in engagement speed. But what Pavel did not have an intact M48 to examine. Israeli forces had recovered their damaged vehicles. All he had were the impacts, the results, the evidence of superiority, without access to the mechanism that produced it. He thought about the engagement times, 10 to 15 seconds. Soviet doctrine assumed that T-54 crews needed about 20 seconds for first shot against an unexpected target. Spot range, estimate, manual elevation adjustment, aim fire. 20 seconds was considered good performance. But if the enemy was consistently achieving first shot in 10 to 12 seconds, they had an 8-second advantage. In tank combat, 8 seconds might as well be 8 minutes. The side that shoots first usually wins. Getting off 2 aimed shots before your opponent fires once was not just an advantage, it was dominance. The door opened. Novikov entered carrying 2 glasses and a bottle of vodka. He poured without asking, slid 1 glass across the table to Pavel. "You look like a man who has seen too much truth for one day." Pavel accepted the glass, drank. The vodka burned going down, but the warmth was welcome after the mental cold of his conclusions. "I need to get my hands on an M48, an intact one. I need to understand how they are achieving these engagement times. There is something in their fire control system that we are missing." Novikov refilled both glasses. "That might be difficult. The Israelis are not going to just give us one of their tanks. What about the Syrians, the Golan Heights? There were tank battles there too. Perhaps they captured something." "Perhaps. I can make inquiries." "But Colonel, what are you going to tell Moscow? General Bogdanov is expecting a report." Pavel was silent for a long time, staring at the vodka in his glass as if it might contain answers. Finally he spoke, and his voice was quiet but absolutely certain. "I'm going to tell him the truth, that the T-54 has fundamental design flaws that make it inferior to the M48 in actual combat conditions, that our doctrine is based on assumptions that are no longer valid, that we need to completely rethink our approach to tank design." That will not be a popular message. I do not care about being popular. I care about not sending more men to die in tanks that cannot protect them. Somewhere in the Soviet Union right now, there are 20,000 young men learning to operate T-55s. They are being told these machines are the best in the world. They are being told Soviet engineering is superior. They are being lied to, and some of them will die because of those lies. Pavel thought about Alexei, learning tank warfare at Kazan, trusting the doctrine, believing the promises. 6 months from now, he would be a lieutenant. He would command a T-55. His life would depend on whether Pavel had the courage to tell the truth now. "I need to write a report tonight. I need to send it to Moscow tomorrow. And Novikov, I need you to help me do something that will probably get us both in trouble." "What?" "I need you to find me a way to test a T-55 against an M48. Not in combat, in a controlled environment. I need to document with the cameras and witnesses exactly what happens when these 2 tanks face each other with equally trained crews. I need proof that is so undeniable that even the most stubborn general cannot ignore it." Novikov poured again, raised his glass. "To truth, then, even when it hurts." They drank. Outside, the Egyptian night was hot and still. Somewhere in that darkness, across the Sinai, across the Suez Canal, Israeli tankers were probably celebrating their victory, probably believing they had won because of superior training or courage or divine favor. They had won because of superior engineering, because someone somewhere in America had understood something that Soviet designers had missed, that the tank was not just a weapon platform, that the crew was not just there to operate the machine, that the relationship between human and machine mattered as much as the specifications of the machine itself. Pavel would spend the next several weeks proving this thesis. He would uncover the secret of the M48's fire control system. He would document the ergonomic advantages that made American crews faster and more effective. He would force Soviet doctrine to confront uncomfortable truths about human factors engineering. But tonight, sitting in a borrowed office, in a defeated country, drinking vodka, with a man whose career was probably over, Pavel felt something he had not felt since Kursk. The cold certainty that everything he thought he knew was wrong, and the heavier burden of knowing that admitting it was the only path forward. June 20th, 1967. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Syrian military intelligence reported that during the fighting on the Golan Heights, they had immobilized 3 Israeli M48 Patton tanks with mines. The vehicles had been abandoned when Israeli forces withdrew from an exposed position. Syrian engineers had attached cables and towed all 3 back behind their own lines before the Israelis could recover them. One M48 was intact, engine damage from the mine track thrown off, but the turret and fire control systems were undamaged and functional. Novikov got the message at 0800 hours and immediately informed Pavel. By 1400, Pavel was on a military transport heading to Damascus. He did not ask for permission from Moscow. Time wasted on bureaucratic authorization was time that might allow someone to decide this investigation was politically inconvenient. Better to act first and apologize later if necessary. Damascus in late June was only slightly less hot than Cairo, but the atmosphere was different. Syria had not collapsed as completely as Egypt. They had lost the Golan Heights, but their army remained somewhat intact. There was anger here rather than the stunned defeat Pavel had seen in Egyptian faces. The captured M48 was being held at a Syrian military base 30 kilometers south of Damascus. Pavel arrived with Berezhkov and 2 other engineers from his team. The Syrian officer in charge, a colonel named Al-Masri, was cooperative. He understood that Soviet advisors were trying to figure out why their tanks had failed. This was in Syria's interest as much as the Soviet Union's. The M48 sat in a maintenance hangar, looking oddly out of place. It was larger than Pavel expected, 3.1 meters tall compared to the T-54's 2.4. The extra height gave it an ungainly appearance, top-heavy, like it might tip over in a hard turn. The armor was cast steel smooth curves rather than the angular welded plates of Soviet design. The turret was bulbous, containing more internal volume than the cramped T-54 turret. On paper, this tank should be inferior. Larger target, heavier, more complex. But Pavel was learning to distrust paper assessments. He climbed onto the hull, pulled open the commander's hatch, lowered himself inside. The first thing that struck him was the space. Pavel was not a large man, 1.75 meter average build, and inside a T-54 turret, he always felt cramped. 3 men squeezed into a volume designed for efficiency rather than comfort. Inside the M48, he could stand almost upright in the turret basket. The commander's station had a proper seat that could rotate independently of the turret. Vision blocks providing 360-degree observation. Controls within easy reach, logically positioned. The gunner's station was even more revealing. Pavel squeezed into the gunner's seat, looked through the primary sight, and stopped breathing. This was not a simple telescopic sight like the TSH-222 used in Soviet tanks. This was something far more sophisticated. 2 eyepieces like a pair of binoculars, but connected to a complex optical mechanism that ran the width of the turret. Pavel had read intelligence reports about American stereoscopic rangefinders, but seeing one in person was different than reading descriptions. He looked through the eyepieces, saw a double image of the far wall of the hangar. 2 identical pictures, slightly offset from each other. There was a knob to his right. He turned it experimentally. The 2 images began to move together. Slowly, carefully, he rotated the knob until the 2 images merged into one. Click, a mechanical sound satisfying in its precision. At that moment, Pavel understood. This was not a guessing device. This was a measuring instrument. The human eye can judge distance to perhaps 500 meters based on binocular parallax, the slight difference in the image seen by each eye. But the M48's rangefinder had two optical paths separated by 1.2 meters far wider than human eyes. This artificial separation created enough parallax to measure distance accurately out to 3,000 meters. When the gunner merged the two images, he was directly inputting the target's range into the fire control system. No estimation, no mental calculation, pure measurement. Pavel called up Berezhkov. "Get in here, you need to see this." Over the next hour, they explored the fire control system like archaeologists uncovering a lost city. The rangefinder was connected to a mechanical device mounted below the turret. They carefully removed an access panel to examine it. The M1301 ballistic computer was a masterpiece of mechanical engineering. Gears, cams, shafts, all precisely machined and assembled. It was heavy, perhaps 32 kilograms, taking up space that Soviet designers would have considered wasted. But its function became clear as they traced the mechanical linkages. The rangefinder input the distance. Other mechanical inputs accounted for barrel temperature, ammunition type, cant angle of the vehicle, even barometric pressure. The computer, through its precisely cut cams and gears, automatically adjusted the gun elevation to the mathematically correct angle for the given range. The gunner did not calculate. He did not estimate. He simply merged the images in the rangefinder, and the computer did the trigonometry. Pure physics, pure mathematics. No human error in the ballistic calculation. Berezhkov traced the mechanical linkages with his finger, following the transmission of data from rangefinder through computer to gun elevation mechanism. He looked like a man witnessing a religious revelation. They automated the mathematics. The gunner's entire job is reduced to identifying the target and pulling the trigger. All the skill, all the training, all the experience required to estimate range and calculate elevation. It is done by this machine, instantly, perfectly, every time. Pavel nodded slowly, and it does it faster than any human, and more accurately, even under stress, even when the gunner is exhausted or scared or has been fighting for hours. The machine does not get tired, does not make arithmetic errors, does not second-guess itself. He climbed out of the turret, stood on the hull, looked at the M48 with new eyes. This was not a tank in the Soviet sense. This was a weapon system, a human-machine integration where the roles were carefully divided. Humans did what humans do well: identify threats, make tactical decisions, maneuver the vehicle. The machine did what machines do well: precise calculation, consistent execution, mathematical accuracy. Soviet doctrine had tried to make humans into perfect calculators. American doctrine had accepted human limitations and compensated with technology. The result was that average American crews could perform at the level of expert Soviet crews, and expert American crews were simply better than anything Soviet training could produce because they had a system that amplified their abilities rather than burdening them with tasks machines could do better. That evening, they conducted an experiment. They positioned the captured M48 in a firing position aimed at a target board placed 1,800 meters away. Pavel recruited a Syrian tank crew who had never operated an M48 before. Through a translator, he gave them basic instruction on the controls: how to traverse the turret, how to use the rangefinder, how to identify when the ballistic computer had set the elevation. Then he timed them from target identification to ready to fire. First attempt with the crew fumbling with unfamiliar controls, 18 seconds. Second attempt, now that they understood the basic procedure, 14 seconds. Third attempt, 12.6 seconds. For comparison, Pavel had them do the same exercise in a Syrian T-55. Same crew, same target, same conditions. First attempt, 23 seconds. Second attempt, 21 seconds. Third attempt, 19.8 seconds. The Syrian crew was faster in the unfamiliar American tank than in their own Soviet-designed vehicle, not by a small margin, by 7 seconds. In tank combat, 7 seconds was an eternity. 7 seconds was the difference between shooting first and dying first. Berezhkov photographed everything: the rangefinder mechanism, the ballistic computer internals, the control layout, the ergonomic design of the crew stations, every detail that explained why the M48 was achieving engagement times that Soviet intelligence had believed impossible. That night, Pavel drafted a cable to General Bogdanov. He chose his words carefully. This was not just a technical report. This was a challenge to 20 years of Soviet doctrine. The cable read General Bogdanov. After extensive field investigation and examination of captured American equipment, I have determined the primary factors contributing to Soviet tank losses in the Middle East conflict. Respectfully submit the following findings require immediate attention and possible doctrine revision. First, American chemical energy ammunition bypasses our armor geometry advantage. Shape charge technology renders slope angle irrelevant. Our metallurgical superiority is negated. Second, T-54, limited gun depression, creates tactical blind spots in non-flat terrain. Hold-down defensive positions become traps when enemy exploits elevation advantage. Third, and most critically, American fire control integration provides consistent 7 to 10 second advantage in engagement time. This advantage stems not from superior crew training, but from superior human-machine interface design. American doctrine automates ballistic calculation, allowing gunner to focus purely on target identification and triggering. Soviet doctrine requires gunner to perform manual range estimation and elevation calculation, introducing human error and time delay. Conclusion. Our design philosophy prioritizes machine specifications over human factors. American philosophy integrates human and machine as system. Result is that average American crew outperforms expert Soviet crew in comparable vehicles. Recommend immediate authorization for comprehensive testing. Request permission to conduct live fire comparison between T-55 and M48 at Kubinka with identical crew training standards. Evidence suggests systemic revision of tank doctrine may be necessary. Respectfully, Colonel P. A. Sokolov. Pavel read the cable 3 times before sending it. Each word was a small betrayal of everything he had believed for 2 decades. Each conclusion was an admission that he personally had been wrong about fundamental aspects of tank design. But the alternative was to lie, to protect his ego while condemning future crews to the same fate that befell the Egyptians and Syrians. To prioritize his career over the lives of men like his son, he encrypted the cable and sent it at 0200 hours Damascus time. Then he went to his quarters and did not sleep. He lay in darkness thinking about Kursk, about the tiger that had killed his friends, about the promise he had made to himself in 1943. He had promised to make Soviet tanks superior. He had tried. He had dedicated his career to that goal, and he had failed because he had been asking the wrong question. The question was not how to make the machine superior. The question was how to make the combined system of human and machine superior. Americans had understood this, Soviets had not, and that difference, that fundamental philosophical gap, had killed thousands of men. June 22, 1967. Moscow time 1400 hours. Pavel received General Bogdanov's response. Report received. Findings disturbing, but analysis appears sound. Your request for comparative testing approved with following conditions. Test will be conducted at Kubinka under controlled observation. You will personally supervise. Defense Ministry representatives will attend. Classification highest level. Prepare for immediate return to Moscow. Additionally, be advised your conclusions have created significant controversy. Some quarters view your analysis as defeatist or pro-Western. Recommend you prepare comprehensive defense of findings. Your career may depend on next 3 weeks. Bogdanov had forwarded Pavel's cable to Defense Minister Andrei Grechko with a cover memo that Pavel would learn about later. Urgent, systemic failure confirmed. Recommend highest level review. The politics had begun. General S.K. Bogdanov, G.A.B. T.U. Pavel smiled grimly. His career, 20 years of work, promotions, respect, recognition, all potentially about to be sacrificed on the altar of honesty. But Alexei was alive, somewhere in Russia learning to be a tank officer, trusting that his father's generation had built weapons worthy of that trust. If Pavel stayed silent now, if he protected his career at the expense of truth, then he was condemning his son and thousands like him to fight in machines that would fail them. The choice was not difficult. It just hurt. He began preparing for the most important test of his life, not a test of tanks, a test of whether Soviet institutions could handle truth even when it was uncomfortable, whether engineering could triumph over politics, whether one man's integrity could move a system designed to resist change. In 3 weeks at the Kubinka Proving Grounds outside Moscow, Pavel Sokolov would stand in an observation bunker and watch an American tank outperform a Soviet tank in front of 30 generals and government officials. He would document with cameras and stopwatches and undeniable data the exact nature of Soviet inferiority. And then he would see if truth was enough, or if, like so many inconvenient truths in Soviet history, it would simply be buried and forgotten while young men continued to die. The investigation was complete. The discovery was made. Now came the hardest part, making people accept what the evidence showed even when acceptance meant admitting decades of mistakes. Pavel packed his notes, his photographs, his measurements. Everything that proved he had been wrong for 20 years. Everything that might save his son's life. He boarded the flight back to Moscow not knowing if he was returning as an honored investigator or a man who had just ended his own career. Either way, the truth was coming, and the Soviet Union's tank doctrine was about to face a reckoning it could not ignore. July 15, 1967, the Kremlin, Moscow. The conference room was smaller than Pavel had expected for a meeting of this importance. 15 meters long, perhaps 8 wide. Oak paneling on the walls. A long table that could seat 20. Portraits of Lenin and current General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev watching from opposite walls with expressions of stern judgment. Pavel stood at one end of the table facing an audience that could end his career with a single vote. 30 men, generals, ministry officials, representatives from the design bureaus, party observers to ensure ideological correctness. And at the center of it all, Defense Minister Andrei Grechko, a man whose signature could authorize anything from a tank design to an execution order. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and tension. Pavel had been speaking for 40 minutes, walking through his findings from Egypt and Syria. The photographs projected on a screen behind him told the story in images that were harder to dismiss than words. Destroyed T-54s, entry wounds showing thermal penetration, the mechanical guts of the M48's fire control system laid bare. Now came the moment of truth, the recommendation that would either change Soviet doctrine or end his career, possibly both. Pavel took a breath, felt the weight of every eye in the room on him, and spoke with a clarity born from absolute certainty. Comrades, I propose we conduct a live fire comparison test. T-55 against M48. Same range, same conditions, same crew training level. Not a combat engagement, but a scientific experiment. We time both tanks from target appearance to first shot. We measure hit probability. We document the difference not in theory, but in observable fact. The room erupted. 3 conversations started simultaneously. A general Pavel did not recognize stood up, face red, voice loud enough to override the others. This is absurd. You want to stage a show trial for our tanks. You want to prove American superiority in front of party observers? What kind of Soviet engineer are you, Sokolov? Pavel kept his voice level. I am the kind of engineer who wants Soviet soldiers to survive combat. If our tanks are inferior, we need to know why so we can fix them. Ignorance does not stop enemy shells. It just kills our men faster. Defense Minister Grechko raised one hand. Silence fell instantly. His voice was quiet but carried absolute authority. Colonel Sokolov, you understand what you are proposing. If your test proves what you claim, we must admit that 65,000 tanks in our inventory are compromised, that our armor doctrine for 20 years has been flawed. The political cost of such admission would be enormous. Yes, Minister, I understand, but the alternative cost is measured in lives, not politics. My son is learning to command a T-55 right now. I will not send him to war in a machine I know is inferior if I can prevent it. Something shifted in Grechko's expression. Not softness exactly, but a flicker of recognition. He too had sons. Every man in this room had sons or nephews or cousins in the military. The abstract question of doctrine became concrete when you had to imagine your own blood inside those steel boxes. Grechko looked left and right, gauging the room. Then he nodded once. Very well. You will have your test. But Colonel Sokolov, if you are wrong, if this proves to be alarmist overreaction, you will face consequences. Are we clear? Completely clear, Minister. Then you have 3 weeks to prepare. Kubinka Proving Grounds, I will attend personally. So will representatives from the Politburo. Make sure your evidence is unquestionable. The meeting adjourned. Pavel gathered his papers with hands that wanted to shake, but which he kept steady through force of will. He had gotten what he asked for: authorization, resources, witnesses. Now he had to prove he was right in a way that would force institutional change. As he left the conference room, a hand gripped his shoulder. Pavel turned to find Colonel Yuri Novikov, who had flown in from Cairo to support the briefing. That took courage, Pavel Andreevich. Possibly foolish courage, but courage nonetheless. Or desperation. I am not sure which anymore. Either way, you have your test, and you have enemies now. I saw General Shumilov watching you. He commanded tank forces in the war. He oversaw T-54 procurement. If you prove the tank is flawed, you prove his career was built on a mistake. Men like that do not forgive easily. Pavel looked back at the conference room door now closed. Behind it, his fate was being discussed by men with power and agendas he could only guess at. Then I will have to be so thoroughly correct that forgiveness is not necessary. Come, we have work to do. The next 3 weeks were a blur of preparation. Pavel requisitioned the best T-55 crew from the Kantemirovskaya Guards Tank Division. Commander Senior Lieutenant Grigory Volkov, 28 years old, third-generation tanker winner of the Soviet tank biathlon 3 years running. Gunner Sergeant Ivan Kuznetsov, 25, trained at the same school where Alexei was currently studying. If any crew could make the T-55 perform at its maximum potential, it was these men. For the M48 side, Pavel selected a standard crew and put them through 2 weeks of intensive training on the captured Syrian vehicle. Lieutenant Andrei Sorokin as gunner competent, but not exceptional. Pavel wanted average operators, not masters. The point was to show that the American system made even typical crews effective, that the M48's design philosophy turned ordinary men into precision instruments of war. The test protocol was simple: single target at 1,800 meters, both tanks starting from the same position, stopwatch timing from the moment the target appeared to the moment the gun fired. 3 runs each, high-speed cameras to document everything. No room for argument or interpretation. Pavel spent nights at Kubinka supervising the range setup, reviewing the test procedures, checking and rechecking every variable. He was functioning on 4 hours of sleep per night and nervous energy. Marina called every evening worried about his health, trying to convince him to rest. You are killing yourself over this, Pasha. Better I kill myself than more young men die in bad tanks. I will rest when this is over. And if they do not believe you, if they decide the test is rigged or the results are anomalous, Pavel had no answer to that. He simply said, then I tried, that will have to be enough. July 26, 1967, Kubinka, Proving Grounds, the day of reckoning. The observation bunker was crowded. 30 people squeezed into a space designed for 15. Defense Minister Grechko in the center, generals to his left and right, Design Bureau representatives, party observers with notebooks, and General Mikhail Shumilov, commander of tank forces, watching Pavel with eyes that promised retribution if this went wrong. Pavel stood near the front clipboard in hand, trying to project confidence he did not entirely feel. The weather was overcast, 18 degrees Celsius, light wind from the west. Good conditions, no excuses. The test range stretched out before them. Flat ground, clear sight lines. At 1,800 meters, a target board showing the silhouette of a tank. Both test vehicles, T-55 and M48, were positioned behind a berm that concealed them from the target. On Pavel's signal, the target would pop up. On the second signal, both tanks would advance over the berm and engage. Pavel lifted the radio handset. Both crews status check. The T-55 commander responded first. Volkov ready? Then the M48. Sorokin ready. Pavel looked at Grechko. The defense minister nodded. Pavel keyed the radio. On my mark. 3, 2, 1. Target up. 1,800 meters away, the target board rose on pneumatic lifts. Simultaneously, both tanks lurched forward, cresting the berm, their guns already traversing toward the target. Inside the T-55, organized chaos unfolded. Pavel could not see it, but he had watched enough training runs to visualize exactly what was happening. Commander Volkov, through his periscope, target bearing 045 range, estimated 1,800. Gunner Kuznetsov, peering through the TSH-222 sight field of view, narrow like looking through a drinking straw hunting for the target. Finding it, using the stadiometric reticle, those little lines in the scope to estimate distance. Mental math. Target height divided by angular size equals range. Quick calculation. Close enough. 1750. Kuznetsov's hands on the manual elevation wheel, cranking it, adding height to the gun barrel. The turret traverse is electric but jerky. He is making fine adjustments, lining up the crosshair. Breathing hard, adrenaline making his hands want to shake. Identified Volkov fire. Pavel's stopwatch showed 18.3 seconds from target appearance to shot. The shell flew down range, hit low 2 meters short of the target. The range estimate had been off by 50 meters. At 1,800 meters distance, 50 meters of error meant a miss. In the bunker, someone made a small noise of disappointment. Pavel kept his face neutral. Now the M48. Sorokin's crew had trained for 2 weeks on this machine. They were competent but not expert, just average quality operators given a better tool. The commander had seen the target engage his override control. The turret slewed smoothly to the bearing, fast-powered by hydraulics that responded to the lightest touch. No jerky manual traverse. No hunting for the target. Sorokin looked through the M17 stereoscopic rangefinder. Saw the double image of the target, his hand on the ranging knob, turning it, watching the images slide together. They merged. Perfect overlap. Click. That sound, mechanical and precise, was the rangefinder inputting the distance into the M13A1 ballistic computer. 1,822 meters. Exact measurement, no human estimation. The computer's gears and cams spun, solving the ballistic equation in less than a second. The gun elevation mechanism moved automatically, raising the barrel to exactly 3.26 degrees above horizontal. Perfect angle for that range, that ammunition, that temperature and wind. Sorokin centered the crosshair on target. Identified. Fire. 11.2 seconds. 7 seconds faster than the T-55. The shell arced downrange. Dead center hit. The target board shook from the impact. In the bunker, absolute silence. The kind of silence that follows the witnessing of something that cannot be unseen or unknown. The numbers were undeniable. The M48 was faster, significantly faster, and more accurate. General Shumilov stood abruptly. One test proves nothing. Conduct it again. Pavel nodded. He had expected resistance. Reset for second run. The process repeated. This time the T-55 crew, knowing they were being judged, tried to go faster. Volkov barked commands more urgently. Kuznetsov rushed his range estimation. The result was worse. 16.8 seconds and a miss, this time high. The M48 crew, calm, methodical, executing the same process they had drilled for 2 weeks. Merge images. Computer calculates. Fire, 10.9 seconds. Another hit. Third run. The T-55 crew was frustrated now, the pressure getting to them despite their elite status. 19.1 seconds. Hit this time, but barely clipping the edge of the target. M48, 11.5 seconds. Center mass hit. Final score. 55, average time. 18.1 seconds, 1 hit out of 3 shots. M48 average time, 11.2 seconds, 3 hits out of 3 shots. Pavel put down his stopwatch, turned to face the observation bunker. Defense Minister Grechko's expression was unreadable. Some of the generals looked angry. Some looked thoughtful. Shumilov looked like a man whose worldview was crumbling in real time. Pavel spoke into the silence. Comrades, this is not about crew quality. Lieutenant Volkov is one of our best tank commanders. Sergeant Kuznetsov won medals for marksmanship. They did everything Soviet doctrine teaches. They performed admirably. Then why did they lose? Grechko asked quietly. Because Soviet doctrine asked them to do too much. They must spot the target, estimate range, calculate elevation, aim, and fire. 5 cognitive tasks performed under stress in sequence. Each task takes time. Each task introduces potential error. The American system automates 2 of those tasks: range estimation and elevation calculation. The crew only has to spot aim and fire. Fewer decisions, less time, more consistency. Pavel pulled out a diagram he had prepared. The M1301 ballistic computer, its mechanical internals laid out like an anatomical drawing. This device weighs 32 kilograms. It costs approximately $847 to manufacture. It is complex. It requires maintenance. By Soviet philosophy, it is overcomplicated luxury. But in combat, it provides a 7-second advantage in every engagement. In tank warfare, 7 seconds is the difference between killing and dying. One of the civilian engineers, a man Pavel recognized from the Uralvagonzavod Design Bureau, spoke up. His voice was defensive. We prioritize simplicity, ease of production, cost efficiency. These are valid engineering concerns. They are valid, Pavel agreed, for 1946. But comrade, the world has changed. NATO tanks now have devices like this. Our adversaries have decided that crew efficiency is worth the cost and complexity. We can argue about philosophy, or we can acknowledge that their philosophy is killing our tanks. Grechko stood. The room fell silent. When the defense minister spoke, his voice carried the weight of decision. What do you recommend, Colonel Sokolov? This was the moment Pavel had been preparing for. The moment when analysis became action, when critique became construction. He had torn down the old doctrine. Now he had to offer something to build in its place. Immediate term 3 measures. First, retrofit existing T-55s with laser rangefinders. We have the technology, TPD-21 model. It provides accurate ranging. Install it fleet-wide over the next 5 years. Cost 12,000 rubles per tank. Expensive, but less than building new tanks. Second measure, revised tactical doctrine. Acknowledge gun depression limitation. Train crews to avoid terrain where this limitation is fatal. Third, improve crew ergonomics in all new designs. Wider turret baskets, better seats, logical control placement. Make the machine serve the man, not enslave him. And long term, we need next-generation designs that incorporate human factors from the beginning. I propose 2 parallel programs, Object 432 and Object 172, which will become T-64 and T-72. But with a new design philosophy, we match NATO not in simplicity, but in system integration. We accept complexity if it saves lives. Grechko looked at the other generals reading the room. Pavel could see the mental calculation happening. The political cost of admission versus the military cost of inaction. Finally, Grechko nodded. Approved. Colonel Sokolov, you will lead the retrofit program. You will also serve as chief technical consultant on the next generation projects. But Sokolov, yes, Minister, you have made enemies today. Some people in this room believe you have humiliated Soviet engineering, that you have given ammunition to our ideological opponents. Watch your back. Competence does not always protect against politics. Understood, Minister. The meeting adjourned. Pavel gathered his papers, his notes, his evidence. He felt exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. He had won. The test had proven what he claimed. The institutions had accepted the truth, however reluctantly. Changes would be made. But the victory felt hollow, because it had taken 1,000 destroyed tanks and thousands of dead Egyptian and Syrian soldiers to force this acknowledgement. How many lives could have been saved if someone had asked these questions in 1955? In 1960, how many of those young men died because engineers like Pavel were too proud to question their own assumptions? That evening, Pavel called home. Marina answered. In the background, he could hear Alexei's voice talking with friends. Home on leave before his final year at Kazan. Pasha, how did it go? We won. They approved the changes. The T-55 will be upgraded. New tanks will incorporate the lessons. It is done. Then why do you sound so sad? Pavel was quiet for a long moment. How to explain the weight of being right about something you wish you had been wrong about? Because I wish I had been smarter sooner. I wish I had questioned the design in 1950 instead of 1967. I wish those Egyptian boys were still alive. You cannot save the past, my love. You can only prevent the future from repeating it. You did that today. Be proud. Can I speak to Alexei? Of course. His son's voice, 19 years old, full of youth and certainty. Father, Mother says you had an important test today. Did our tanks perform well? Pavel chose his words carefully. Alexei, the tanks performed as designed, But I learned that good design is harder than I thought. When they assign you to a unit, you will be commanding a T-55M. It will be better than the old model, safer, because we learned some hard lessons this year. You made it better. I tried to. Listen to me, son. When you are a commander, question everything. Do not assume that because something is doctrine, it is correct. The best officers are the ones who think for themselves. Remember that. I will, father. I promise. After the call ended, Pavel sat alone in his office at GAB-2 headquarters. On his desk was the photograph from Mitla Pass, the destroyed T-54s stretching across the desert. He had carried that photograph with him every day for 6 weeks, a reminder of what happened when engineering pride superseded engineering honesty. He filed it carefully in a folder marked 6-Day War Analysis, classified. Someday, perhaps decades from now, historians would read these reports and understand what had happened, how a disaster in the desert had forced a superpower to confront uncomfortable truths about its military technology. But Pavel would not be around to read those histories. His job now was to ensure the lessons were implemented, that the changes actually happened, that institutional inertia did not quietly bury the reforms once public attention moved on. The years that followed were hard. Pavel was promoted to full colonel and given broad authority over tank modernization programs. But he was also politically isolated. General Shumilov and his faction never forgave the public demonstration that their beloved T-54 was flawed. They blocked Pavel's advancement when they could spread rumors about his loyalty, questioned whether he was too sympathetic to Western technology. Pavel endured it. He focused on the work. The T-55 retrofit program began in 1968. Laser rangefinders installed on 500 tanks the first year, 2000 the second year. The difference was measurable. In training exercises, first-round hit probability went from 40% to 70%. Engagement time dropped from 18 seconds to 13 seconds. Still not as good as NATO, but competitive enough to matter. The T-64 program moved forward with Pavel as technical consultant. The designer Alexander Morozov was the same man who had created the T-54. Their meetings were tense at first. Morozov saw Pavel as the man who had criticized his life's work. Pavel saw Morozov as a brilliant engineer trapped by outdated assumptions. Slowly, grudgingly, they found common ground. Morozov brought deep knowledge of armor and suspension. Pavel brought hard lessons about fire control and crew factors. The T-64 that emerged from their collaboration was a compromise, but a functional one. Gun depression improved to 6 degrees, still not ideal, but better than the T-54's 4. Fire control included a ballistic computer, not as sophisticated as the American version, but functional. Ergonomics improved marginally. It was not revolutionary, but it was evolutionary. And in military technology, evolution that happens is better than revolution that stays on paper. October 6, 1973, Yom Kippur War, 6 years after the 6-Day War disaster. Pavel was 50 years old now. Still a colonel, his promotion to general, blocked by political enemies. Still serving as a technical consultant. Still watching reports from Middle East conflicts with the anxiety of a man who knows his son might someday fight in these same conditions. Alexei was 25, a captain now having risen quickly through the ranks, his performance at Kazan and early command assignments marking him for rapid advancement. Commanding a T-64 company in the 4th Guards Tank Division. Stationed in East Germany, but on alert status, ready to deploy if the geopolitical situation required it. The relationship between father and son had been strained these past years. Alexei did not understand why his father seemed so critical of Soviet armor. Pavel could not explain without revealing classified information about just how close the T-54 had come to catastrophic failure. The Yom Kippur War began with another surprise attack, this time with Egypt and Syria striking Israel simultaneously. The Egyptian army that crossed the Suez Canal was far better equipped and trained than in 1967. They had new Soviet weapons, a T-3 Sagar anti-tank missiles, ZSU-23-4 Shilka air defense systems. And most importantly for Pavel's calculations, they had upgraded T-55s with laser rangefinders and improved training. Pavel monitored the situation from Moscow. The initial reports were encouraging. Egyptian T-55s were performing far better than in 1967. Not winning exactly, Israeli forces were still formidable, but fighting effectively. The kill ratios were improving, from 4-1 in 1967 to approximately 2-1 now. Still unfavorable, but survivable. On the Syrian front, the situation was more complex. Syrian forces included T-62 tanks, the successor to the T-55. These had better guns and improved fire control. Against Israeli M48s and M60s, they were achieving near-parity performance in tank-versus-tank combat. The overall war was still being lost. Israeli air superiority and superior tactics dominated, but the pure armor engagements were far more competitive. The reports included detailed after-action analyses. Pavel read them obsessively, looking for evidence that the reforms had mattered. And the evidence was there. Egyptian crews using laser rangefinders were hitting targets at first shot rates 3 times higher than in 1967. Syrian T-62s with improved fire control were matching Israeli tanks in individual engagements even when they lost the larger battle. It was working, not perfectly. Soviet armor was still not equal to NATO in every respect, but it was competitive. Soviet tankers were no longer being sent into fights they had no chance of winning. The reforms Pavel had fought for in 1967, the changes that had cost him politically, were saving lives. November 3, 1973. The war was winding down. Another ceasefire, another Arab military defeat, but not another catastrophe. And then Pavel received the phone call that made all the professional struggles worthwhile. Marina calling from their Moscow apartment, her voice shaking. "Pasha, I just spoke with Alexei's commander. There was an incident. Training exercise in East Germany. A T-64 rolled over during maneuvers. The company commander was inside." Pavel's heart stopped. "Alexei, he is alive. Broken arm, concussion, but alive. The T-64's design, the wider turret basket you insisted on there, was room for him to brace himself when it rolled. The doctor said if he had been in an old T-55 with the cramped space, the injuries would have been far worse, possibly fatal." Pavel sat down heavily. His hands were shaking. The irony was almost too much. His son saved by the design changes Pavel had fought for. The reforms that started with a desert full of dead tanks had just prevented Pavel from becoming one of those fathers who receive official condolence letters. "Can I speak with him?" "He is sedated. But Pasha, he left a message for you. He said to tell you that you were right, that good design matters, that he understands now why you were so obsessed with making the tanks better." After the call, Pavel sat in his office for a long time staring at nothing. 6 years of political struggle. Career advancement blocked. Colleagues who thought he was too critical, too Western, too willing to admit Soviet shortcomings. And all of it, every bit of professional pain, was worth it for that single moment. His son alive because of changes Pavel had insisted upon. The next decade passed. Pavel continued his work quieter now, less confrontational, but no less committed. The T-72 program scaled up production, creating a tank that was cheaper than the T-64, but incorporated many of the same human factors improvements. The T-80 followed in the late 1970s, adding thermal sights and more powerful engines. Soviet tank doctrine evolved. Gun depression requirements were written into design specifications. Fire control systems were prioritized. Crew ergonomics became an official consideration rather than an afterthought. The changes happened slowly. Bureaucracies resist change even when lives depend on it, but they happened. Pavel was never promoted to general. His career topped out at colonel. The political cost of being the man who proved Soviet tanks were flawed was too high for the system to reward him fully. He accepted this. Some truths are expensive to speak. The price of honesty is often paid in opportunities not given. 1982. Pavel retired at age 57. The official ceremony was small. A few colleagues, a certificate, a modest pension. He had served 36 years in Soviet tank development, from the battlefields of Kursk to the proving grounds of Kubinka to the conference rooms where doctrine was written and rewritten. His final act before retirement was to write a classified technical memoir, 200 pages documenting what he had learned about tank design human factors, the importance of honest assessment over institutional pride. It was filed in the GABTU archives with a classification that would keep it hidden for decades. In the introduction, Pavel wrote, "The lesson of 1967 was not that American tanks were better. It was that we stopped questioning ourselves." Every engineer must hold in his mind two contradictory truths: that his work matters deeply, and that his work may be fundamentally flawed. The tension between these truths is where progress happens. The moment we resolve that tension by deciding we are right and need not question further, we begin to fail. We just do not know it yet until young men die proving us wrong. This is the engineer's curse. Our mistakes are measured in lives. Pavel lived quietly in retirement, a small apartment in Moscow, time with Marina, visits from Alexei, now a major, and his two grandchildren. He followed developments in tank design with the interest of a retired craftsman watching younger generations refine his trade. He noted with quiet satisfaction that the T-80 entering service in the early 1980s had gun depression of 7 degrees, improved fire control, and crew stations that prioritize human efficiency. Not perfect, still compromises, but vastly better than the T-54 he had helped create 40 years earlier. The ultimate vindication came in 1991, though Pavel would not have called it that. Desert Storm. American M1 Abrams tanks facing Iraqi T-72s in the deserts of Kuwait and Iraq. The kill ratios were devastating. 5-1, 8-1, even worse in some engagements, all in favor of American forces. Pavel watched the news reports on television, 76 years old now. Health declining. The images were painfully familiar. Destroyed Soviet-designed tanks scattered across desert terrain. The same pattern from 1967, just repeated with newer models. Marina found him crying in front of the television. "Pasha, what is wrong?" They did not learn, or they learned and then forgot. The same mistakes, different tanks but the same philosophy. Prioritize the machine over the crew. Believe our own propaganda about technical superiority. And young men die. Again. Still. But there was one crucial difference. Among the destroyed Iraqi T-72s were tanks that had been built to export specifications with downgraded fire control and iron armor compared to the versions the Soviet military used. The best Soviet tanks, the ones incorporating Pavel's reforms, were never in that fight. The reforms had worked. They just had not been exported to every nation that bought Soviet armor. Pavel understood the bitter irony. His work had saved Soviet tankers. The improved fire control, the better ergonomics, the honest assessment of weaknesses and systematic fixing of them. Soviet crews in T-80S were as capable as NATO crews in Leopard 2s or Challenger tanks. But the export models built down to a price point, lacking the best equipment, those were still death traps. You cannot save everyone. You can only do your best and hope it matters. December 15, 1998. Pavel Andreevich Sokolov died at age 73. The official obituary was brief. Colonel retired. Tank development specialist. Served with distinction. Survived by his wife, one son, 3 grandchildren. The truth of his contributions would not become public for another 5 years. In 2003, Russian military historians were given limited access to Soviet-era archives as part of a research project on Cold War weapons development. Among the documents they uncovered was Pavel's technical memoir and his classified reports from the Six-Day War investigation. A young historian named Dmitry Volkov, no relation to the tank commander from 1967, recognized the significance of what he was reading. This was not just technical documentation. This was the story of how institutional honesty, at great personal cost, had saved thousands of lives. He published a paper that brought Pavel's work into public knowledge. By then, everyone who had opposed Pavel was dead. General Shumilov had died in 1989. Defense Minister Grechko in 1976. The political battles that had defined Pavel's career were historical footnotes. What remained was the work itself, the reforms that had reshaped Soviet tank doctrine, the improvements that had given Soviet tankers a fighting chance against NATO armor. In 2005, the Russian military named a lecture hall at the Kazan Higher Tank Command School after Pavel. A small plaque outside the door read, Colonel P.A. Sokolov, 1925 to 1998. He had the courage to admit mistakes so that others might live. This is the highest form of service. Alexei attended the dedication ceremony. He was 57 years old, a retired major general, having risen to ranks his father never achieved. In his speech, he told the assembled cadets about his father's philosophy. My father believed that good engineering serves the human. that machines exist to make people more capable, not to replace them. He believed that admitting error is stronger than defending pride. And he believed that every decision an engineer makes is ultimately a moral decision because those decisions affect lives. If you remember nothing else from your time at this school, remember that. The tank is not just metal. It is the means by which young men like yourselves survive to go home to their families. Design accordingly. The lessons Pavel learned in the desert in 1967 became standard curriculum. Cadets studied the Six-Day War not as a story of Arab defeat, but as a case study in the importance of human factors in military technology. They learned about gun depression, fire control integration, ergonomic design. They learned that the side which learns fastest from defeats wins the next war. And perhaps most importantly, they learned that one person with evidence and integrity can change institutional direction even when that change is uncomfortable. That speaking truth to power is not insubordination if the truth is backed by data and spoken with respect. That the system, despite its flaws, can accept criticism if that criticism comes with solutions. Today, if you visit the Kubinka Tank Museum outside Moscow, you can see both a T-54 and an M48 Patton side by side. The displays explain the technical differences, the range-finding systems, the fire control philosophy, the human factors considerations, and there is a quote on the wall between them from Pavel's classified memoir, now declassified. These two machines represent two philosophies of engineering. One assumes human operators will adapt to whatever the machine demands. The other assumes the machine must adapt to human capabilities and limitations. Both are valid approaches, but only one of them consistently wins battles. The lesson is not that one nation's engineering is superior. The lesson is that engineering divorced from human reality, no matter how theoretically elegant, fails when tested against engineering, grounded in how humans actually function under stress. This is the lesson we learned at catastrophic cost in 1967. May future generations learn it more cheaply. Visitors to the museum, including many from NATO countries, often spend a long time at that display. Reading the quote, looking at the two tanks, understanding that the Cold War was not just about ideology or politics, it was about thousands of individual decisions made by engineers and designers and officers. Decisions about what mattered, what to prioritize, how to balance competing requirements. And sometimes it was about one man's willingness to say, "I was wrong," loud enough that it echoed through decades of institutional practice and saved lives he would never meet. The final irony of Pavel's story came in the 2000s as warfare evolved again. Unmanned systems, drones, remote warfare. The human element that Pavel had fought so hard to properly integrate into tank design was being removed entirely in some new weapon systems. The debate he had participated in, human versus machine cooperation versus replacement, remained as relevant as ever. But the principle endured. The best military systems, whether manned or unmanned, succeeded by understanding the relationship between human decision-making and machine capability, by not asking either to do what they were poorly suited for, by designing systems that leverage the strengths of both. This was Pavel's true legacy, not any specific tank design, not any particular technical improvement, but the philosophy that honest assessment matters more than pride, that serving the human operator is not weakness, but wisdom, that the engineer's responsibility is to the soldier who will use his work, not to the institution that employs him. A simple philosophy, a difficult one to practice, and one that in Pavel's case was learned at terrible cost in a desert far from home, among the wreckage of assumptions that seemed so certain until the shells started flying. In the end, Pavel kept the promise he made to himself at Kursk in 1943. Not perfectly, not immediately, but eventually at great personal cost, he ensured that Soviet soldiers were not sent to war with inferior weapons. He made Soviet tanks better, not through genius, not through technical innovation, but through the simple, brutal, necessary willingness to admit when something was wrong and then fix it. That is the impossible defeat. Not the tanks destroyed in Sinai, but the defeat of pride, the surrender of ego, the admission that you spent 20 years building something flawed and now must acknowledge it publicly. That defeat, that personal catastrophe, was what allowed institutional change. And that change, measured in seconds, shaved off engagement time, and percentages gained in hit probability, translated into lives. Somewhere in Russia, a man who would have died in a cramped T-54 with inadequate fire control instead survived in a T-72 with better ergonomics and a laser rangefinder. He never knew Pavel's name, never knew that his survival was the result of decisions made in a Kremlin conference room and validated at a proving ground outside Moscow. But Pavel knew, and that was enough. The greatest achievements are often invisible to those they benefit. The engineer whose bridge does not collapse is not celebrated by the people who cross it safely. They simply cross and continue their lives. Only when bridges fail do we remember that someone somewhere had to make good decisions for that crossing to be uneventful. Pavel Sokolov made good decisions, eventually, after bad ones. After learning, after admitting error and bearing the cost of that admission. And thousands of people crossed the bridge he rebuilt without ever knowing it had been broken. That is the quiet legacy of honest engineering in a world that often values pride over truth. The lives saved are invisible. The disasters prevented never make the news. Only the dedication to do better, to question assumptions, to serve the human end user above institutional convenience, that dedication echoes forward through time. From the wheat fields of Kursk, to the deserts of Sinai, to the proving grounds of Kubinka, to the lecture halls where young officers learn that mistakes are only failures if you do not fix them, Pavel's journey represents something larger than one man or one tank or one war. It represents the possibility of institutional learning. The hope that systems, despite their inertia and pride and political pressures, can change when confronted with undeniable evidence. That truth, properly documented and courageously spoken, has power even against entrenched interests. This is why his story matters. Not because Soviet tanks became perfect. They did not. Not because one man changed everything. He did not. But because he proved that one person with data and integrity can shift the trajectory of an institution, can save lives, can make tomorrow marginally better than yesterday. In a world of grand narratives and sweeping changes, this modest ambition to simply do better, to learn from mistakes, to serve those who depend on your work, may be the most revolutionary achievement of all. The impossible defeat was never about tanks. It was about pride. And the victory was never about military hardware. It was about the willingness to change. That war, the one fought in conference rooms and proving grounds and late-night offices, is the one that saves lives. Pavel Sokolov won that war. The victory was quiet. The cost was high, but the victory endured. And in the end, that is the only kind of victory that matters.